So one of the things that we're interested in here at the Institute for Work and Health is the changing nature of work. I mean, times are changing and workplaces are changing. And so this study was sort of fueled by that interest. And we're very interested in looking at temporary work agencies as part of the changing nature of work. I'd like to introduce the team that I was working with. So Ron Saunders, who you just heard from, is our senior scientist from the Institute for Work and Health on this study. He's an economist and sort of, I guess, a policy wonk, which is great. Catherine Lapel is our lawyer on the study. She's the Canada Research Chair in Occupational Health and Safety based at the University of Ottawa. Iggy Cosney is a scientist who has been with the Institute specializing in sort of non-standard work. Liz Mansfield is also here at the Institute, and she specializes in injury prevention issues. And Christine Carrasco is also here at the Institute, and she specializes in non-standard work. So we've had a great team to bring this work together, and we've been working on this study for a couple of years now. So why study temporary work agencies? Well, most of you know about temporary work agencies. Many of you in your workplaces might have had temporary agency workers in your workplace. We've certainly had them here at the Institute for Work and Health when we need someone quickly and, there's a position. It's becoming an increasingly standard part of work these days. And the sector itself is flourishing internationally. And also, when we think about temporary work agencies, we have tended to think about them in the past as sort of finding help in your workplace when you have people on holiday or someone's sick and you need them quickly. But an interesting thing about the role of temp agencies in our economy these days is that they're increasingly becoming a standard part of workplaces. There are some workplaces where it's just basically almost a permanent aspect of the workforce to have temporary workers there, temporary agency workers there. And indeed, it's been some permanent jobs are being converted into temporary work agency positions within workplaces. So temporary work agencies are playing different roles over time. And there's a particular aspect of temporary work agencies that is of interest, and that's the triangular employment arrangement. You have the worker, you have the temporary agency, who's the employer, and then you have the client employer, who the worker is sent out to. And it can get a little complicated in terms of who's responsible for what, who knows what, when does one party do one thing and the other the other. So this is an interesting aspect of it that attracted us to this topic as well. It's a little different from the normal employment relationship with just the employer and the worker. As well, temporary work agency workers are at greater risk of occupational injury than permanent workers, and this is something that's been documented internationally. Studies out of Netherlands and Germany, this study showed that temporary work agencies accounted for as much as 13% of occupational accidents, but comprise only 3% of jobs. Out of Finland, studies showing that workplace accident frequency for temp agency workers is on the increase despite a general downward trend in main industries. Studies out of the USA have shown how temp agency workers have higher workers' compensation claim incidence rates than those in standard employment arrangements, longer claim durations, and in the construction and manufacturing sectors double the incident rate. In Canada, I've got question marks here. It's hard to know. Recently, Statistics Canada has collapsed all of their categories of temporary workers into one category, so it's impossible now to understand exactly what's going on with temporary agency workers. But we know from earlier studies about employment relationships, temporary agency workers compared to other types of temporary workers tend to earn less, have less union representation, and so on. So, given these conditions, how do temp agencies manage occupational health and safety and injury prevention? Well, just before we begin talking about the studies, a little more background here. In the WSIB Operational Policy Manual, we know that the temporary agency is considered to be the sole employer of these temp workers for the purposes of the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act. The supply of labor industry, the agency supplying and paying the worker, not the employer to whom the worker is supplied, is responsible for covering the agency's workers under the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act. So this is a critical part of background for this study, because experience-rated premiums are a key prevention mechanism in Ontario. Employers have rebates and surcharges depending on the number of accidents that they have. It's the way that we try to motivate workplaces to maintain safe workplaces. The agency is the party to which the experience-rated premiums are applied. They're the employer that are supposed to be motivated or supposed to be able to manage the risk of the worker. Okay? Now, under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, both the temp agency and the client employer are considered a responsible employer. So in practice, when we look at how fines are applied, you will see if there's a fatality, if there's a very serious accident, you'll see fines being applied, and you'll see both of them being fined. Usually the temp agency being fined a lot less than the client employer. In terms of this experience-rated premiums, there is a safety group in Ontario that's formed that's comprised of temporary work agencies, and they get huge rebates. 2006, they had a $600,000 rebate. 2007, it went up to $1.7 million. And this past year, it was just under $1 million. So, this was interesting to us. Yeah?
Does the first one mean that they pay the premiums?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is interesting to us because you saw the previous slide that showed that temp agency workers are at higher risk and tend to have more accidents. But this group does very well in terms of rebates. So we wondered, well, what's going on? Can we learn something from this sector, or how does it work? So given that rebates and penalties with experience-rated premiums are a key incentive in prevention of injury and disability, we wanted to understand how it worked in the context of temp agencies and client employers. That was sort of the focus of the study. So what I'll talk about today is I'll describe how we conducted this study. I'll go through some of our findings, talking about the quality of the employment relationship, the relationship between occupational health and safety and business interests, how injury prevention is carried out, how the client employer fits into injury prevention, and the issue of occupational health and safety costs that are applied to the agencies. How do they manage the costs? Conclusions and policy recommendations. Okay, so these were our main research questions. This is a qualitative study. We don't know very much about how temp agencies actually do occupational health and safety. So qualitative research is particularly useful when you don't know what the key issues are yet. You wouldn't even know what to measure, right, if you wanted to measure something. So we're going in there saying, well, what's going on and how does it work? So how are temp agencies organized? How do they actually do injury prevention and return to work? And I'm mostly focusing on injury prevention in this talk today. We have so much data, I had to focus on one issue. And what governance is provided by law and policy. So we conducted interviews and focus groups. We reviewed documents and engaged in discourse analysis of the data and legal analysis. We conducted interviews with workers who would work for temp agencies, client employers who hired labor through temp agencies, the agencies themselves, key informants with particular insight into this sector, and then we analyzed legislation, cases, case law, policies, media, and other documents. An important aspect of the study was our purposive sample of workers. We're focusing this study on workers who tend to do those low-wage, low-skill jobs, general labor. We decided not to go with, you can be a temp worker, you can be a CEO temp, right? There's all kinds of temp workers out there. But we were particularly interested in those at the low end of the spectrum, just to see how things were working out for them. So this is what our findings are based on, is that low end. And here's our sample. So we had 19 workers. They were engaged in jobs like general labor, warehouse work, service work, some driving work, that sort of thing. The client employers, we went to 11 workplaces and interviewed 12 people. They were involved in the transportation, beverage, manufacturing, property management, laboratory, restaurant, waste management, warehouse work, those sorts of jobs. And the roles of the people we spoke to the VPs of businesses, senior managers, and site supervisors. We got a bit of a range from sort of the high-end financial aspects of it to the people who are actually the ones supervising the temp workers. Most of our sample was focused on the temp agencies. And we went to 17 agencies and spoke to 22 people. And we wanted to get a range of agencies. So 6 of them were the big multinationals, names that you would have all heard of. 2 of them were mid-size, and 9 of them were small. Of course, you can't name any names because all of the participants are guaranteed anonymity and confidentiality, but it just gives you an idea of the type. And we looked at the jobs they were placing people in: manufacturing, general labor, forklift, operators, warehouse, those sorts of things. And in terms of the roles, we spoke to the recruiters who get the workers in and assess them and send them out, office managers, owners, CEO of one of the multinationals, and risk management specialists. Those were the ones employed by the multinationals who would be responsible, for instance, for all of Canada, managing their claims and prevention initiatives for the agencies. And then we went to key informants. We had questions. One of the nice aspects of qualitative research is you start gathering data and you say, okay, I'm going to talk to these groups. And then you start saying, well, why does it work like this? And how is the law interpreted in these events and these sorts of things? And that led us to go to these key informants. And so we spoke to workers' compensation and occupational health and safety regulators who were sort of well placed to answer questions like these, legal advisors, health and safety inspector, representatives from the temp industry, and worker advocates familiar with this type of work.
Lynn, could you say a bit more about how you recruited for and selected your employers?
What we did, actually, is we first recruited the workers. And then we wanted to go to the types of agencies and workplace that they had come from. We didn't match them up. And so we sought out employers who employed people for the type of work. And it wasn't easy finding them. A lot of these employers are sort of back office. They're like warehouses out behind the airport and really hard to track down. We did a lot of cold calling to find them, and then we screened them for eligibility, have you hired through temp agencies. It was mostly that.
So, for example, if you had interviewed a worker that worked in the beverage manufacturing industry, then you might go in.
Yeah, we just sort of looked through the phone book and we were interested in different areas. We weren't just saying, we didn't have a budget to travel very far, but anything within driving distance of a few hours of Toronto, we did. And so we were also looking for range. We didn't want to just know how things were done here. There were some smaller towns as well. Yeah.
Following up on that, I don't know the answer to this, is there a difference in temp work agencies that hire or place not low-wage workers versus those that place low-wage workers?
We didn't go to the ones who only do high-end.
So are they different?
I don't know. We didn't go to them. So, yeah. That would be another study, right, to compare the difference. I mean, some of the ones that we did, especially the multinationals, they do everything, right? But they may have certain staff who focus on the low end.
But there would be descriptions of what companies offer on their website.
Oh, of course, yeah.
So.
Yeah. So some mostly focused on lower end, and then some were all over. They were big enough to do everything. Yeah. In terms of the documents that we looked at, we did document analysis as well. We looked at all of the promotional material, the temp agency's websites. There were online blogs where temp agency workers and managers would write. There was legislation that we could look at and media articles, and the legal analysis of the acts and the case law as well. When we were conducting the interviews, the general questions were put to everyone. We wanted to understand the experience of working with a temp agency if you're contracting with them, or for a temp agency if you're a worker. Pros and cons of working with a temp agency or with temporary workers if you're the client or the temp agency, or with client employers. How does the communication work? Is it all online? Do you meet face-to-face? Contractual arrangements. We didn't have access to any of the actual contracts. That was very difficult to access, but we asked a lot about them. Management of labor challenges, experience with health and safety issues, injury prevention, and return to work. That was the general focus of the interviews. And the analysis was iterative. We would learn about what was going on, and we would fold new questions into the next interviews. So, I heard about this issue. How does it work? How do you guys manage these things? We had systematic data, coding procedures. We're always looking at interconnections between issues, and constant comparison, negative case analysis, these sorts of things. And all of our data analysis were done by several team members, and all of the analyses were brought back to the table to be discussed by the full team. So it's quite a comprehensive data analysis approach. And we also had an advisory committee to guide this study that we felt covered some of the key stakeholders: WSIB, Ministry of Labour, Office of the Employer Advisor, Office of the Worker Advisor, Workers' Action Centre, Toronto Workers' Health and Safety Legal Clinic, Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, and the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. And we went to these stakeholders at different points of the study. At the beginning, with our idea and design, here's what we're thinking of doing. Do you think we're asking the right questions, focusing on the right issues? And we got feedback then. For instance, initially we hadn't been thinking about including the client employers, and someone said, well, that's critical. And of course it was, and we built that into our design. And we've met with this committee twice since then to talk about preliminary findings, our interpretation of them, their interpretation of them, so that we can try to get it right and be focusing on relevant issues. Okay, now to the findings. So, first is the social environment of temp agency work. This isn't an issue of good guys and bad guys. Some employers are good, some are bad, some workers are good, some are bad. It's an issue of the structural situation of temp agency workers. You really don't have much of a connection between the worker and the temp agency. You come in, you get screened for your skills, you get sent out. There's not much connection, the personal, social connection between the agencies and the workers. And that was reflected in all of the vocabulary. We were looking at these workers who were doing the lower skill, lower end work. And so this is probably what you hear reflected in what they say, feeling like a second-class citizen, feeling like a commodity, feeling disposable. Because you're being sent out all the time. You're just hoping to be sent out for work. An important thing about the workers in our sample is with this type of work, mostly they've exhausted other attempts at employment. And you're going through an agency because you can't get anything else, and you're hoping to be able to get hired on. The temp to perm promise is always hanging there. Maybe with this employer we'll place you, maybe they'll hire you. So that was the sort of environment. The agencies, when we asked about number of staff, they talk about T4s. Well, I have 1,600 T4s. Those are the tax forms, right? Because you have people coming and going all year. Or another agency employer said, well, the workers are like a product, like hamburgers. Or they use terms like recycling. Sometimes we recycle workers, and that means if they get, client employers can decide at any point, no, we don't want that worker, please take them back. And the worker gets withdrawn immediately. And then they can just send them out to another employer. And that's the privilege of the client employers. They don't have to explain why they don't want a worker. And then the client employers, you hear the same sort of distant, rather objectifying language. An employer said, send me some gorillas. I said, send me some gorillas. He needed someone to empty heavy boxes out of the back of a truck. He wanted, strong workers. I put in my order for workers. Or workers have a flexibility mindset, saying this employer was explaining they don't mind being told that they have a whole day work and at 11 o'clock saying, sorry, it's all up, you can go home now. They said, these workers have a flexibility mindset, they don't mind. Well, if you talk to the workers, they do mind because they're hoping to get a whole day's work. But what struck us was that the vocabulary and the language is different to other studies that we've conducted where we talk about health and safety and the relationships between employers and workers. And it's not surprising because there actually is a very distant relationship between these employers and these workers. So within this detached context, occupational health and safety, we found, competed with business interests. If you think about when you do have a relationship with your employer, there will be some sort of social investment in you. There'll be someone who cares in a way about you and what happens to you. But when you aren't connected to your employer, you don't have the same sort of social layer to compete with business interests. And we found that client employers were hiring workers for relatively dangerous, dirty work. And here's a client employer who says, I'll hire a couple of guys for half a day for unloading the container loaded with goods. It's just heavy-duty work that I'd rather not have my guys doing. And in a more extreme situation, here's a health and safety inspector who describes, a company in Ontario bought this load of lumber, and then they open it up and they find the material was stored unsafely inside the container. So instead of sending their workers, they got hold of temporary agency, and they sent 2 workers. And when the doors were open, when they were handling the material, the load came apart and killed the guy. I mean, that's a rather extreme example, but it is, we did keep finding this issue of hiring agency workers for the work that you'd rather not have your workers do. And agencies did what they could to prevent injuries. We asked agencies a lot, what do you do? How do you try to manage injury prevention? And they did what they could. But the challenge is, because they are not managing the work, problems crop up, and we just couldn't see how their injury prevention initiatives could be effective. 7 main reasons why. First, agencies never actually control the work or own the work site, right? They're sending someone out to someone else's work site. And here's a couple of quotes. Here's Kate, who's the CEO of a large agency, who said, we have a responsibility from an oversight standpoint, but at an ongoing standpoint, we can't manage the workforce. We don't own the building or the equipment. And here is something from our document analysis from one of a newsletter from the president of People Bank. He says, in the temporary staffing industry, there's a highly transitional workforce that enters a work environment that companies like the People Bank cannot manage, supervise, or control. Okay, so the agencies, very senior people and very large agencies said this. It wasn't something they wanted to hide or gloss over. It's a fact of temporary agency work. So the agencies, when they brought the workers in, they did provide them with generic occupational health and safety training. The workers would all do the WMIS training. If they were being sent to a warehouse, they would be watching a video on safe lifting, those sorts of generic safety preparation that you could do. And then when you get to the work site, the client employers are supposed to show the worker around and show them the specific risks at the work site. But despite this arrangement, there are challenges because by definition, these workers are new to a worksite, right? They're temp workers coming in. There are specific local hazards that pose special dangers to them. Workers on a new site don't know their way around it. They don't know the flow of work. Even if they're introduced to a special hazard, there's the timing and the pace of things. Linda?
Did you hear mention of these workers being trained in their rights with respect to the law, like the right to use unsafe work?
Yeah. The agencies would tell the workers about that, and I have a slide addressing that in a moment. Yeah. So here's the temp agency worker. He describes the situation. If it's your first time in a warehouse, a lot of people don't even realize what's going on. They're just stumbling around and falling over and knocking things down, and it's just one of those things. And then here is a worksite supervisor from one of the client employer sites who describes some of the risks as well. And this was a place where they were handling a lot of tires, big wheels. Says there's a way to grab the wheel. This agency guy, he's grabbing the tire and then throwing it while you're carrying the dead weight of the wheel. We all learned that if you grabbed it a little lower, the tire would start to spin. It gives us momentum. But we never showed anybody, any of the agency staff, any of that stuff, not how to handle a tire, not where to stand, how to put your feet, how to throw it right. None of that stuff. They never got any of that experience from us. Now in this work site, they didn't want the temp agency workers. So there was acrimony going on. But that's not always unusual in workplaces too, where you get social divisions between the permanent staff and the temp staff. So in this workplace, even though the employer might have said, here's the tires, the sort of the hidden skills that workers would share with each other don't always get shared and can play an important role in accidents. Agencies discussed it as good practice to go out and inspect work sites before placing a worker. And a lot of the agencies that we interviewed did that. Some of the smaller ones didn't. But that's what sort of the best practices in the sector were. But a challenge with that is that work conditions, you can inspect a work site, but then you place the worker, and then things go on day after day after day, right? The point in time has changed. So work conditions can change, and this plays a role in accidents as well. So here's a small agency owner who says, we have one customer who has a habit of unguarding their machinery as soon as their backs are turned. The only 3 incidents of injury that we've had in the last 2 years have all been in the same place, and it have been because they take the bottom guards off the machine. It moves a lot faster. And here's another one at a multinational agency. The challenges become when the client changes what they're looking for. They change the requirement when the person is there versus giving the person different work. You try and keep on top of it the best we can, but we're not there. In a lot of cases, the person we deal with isn't the lead hand on the floor. So you can't always see the changes that are happening. So see, pre-inspection doesn't always help with some of these issues. And even if an agency does inspect a work site, it's not their site, right? And these agency workers, they've taken courses to try to understand occupational health and safety and whatnot. They can be in-house courses or the like, but they really don't have the skills of a trained health and safety inspector, and don't always recognize hazards. So for 2 reasons. 1 is they don't have the full skill range. 2 is it's not their work site, and so they don't know the ins and the outs of the hazards. And they have limited enforcement capacity even if they do see them. So here, for instance, is an inspector describing this. He says, the other thing with the temp agency is they've started to do an assessment of the company. So someone is supposed to go out and do a walk-around tour. But they don't know what they're looking at, even though they go and do a survey. Like the one with the guy that was killed. They did a site inspection survey, and part of that survey was it machine guarded? And nowhere were they even close to meeting requirements. The agencies tried to manage the fact that they weren't at the work site and didn't know the changing worksite conditions by asking the workers to speak up and tell them, right? They were very explicit about that. Tell us what they're asking you to do. You have the right to refuse work. You don't have to do it, and come and tell us. But in the case of these workers, they were underemployed. They really needed those jobs. And they didn't want to risk upsetting people. If they were hoping to get a permanent placement, they didn't want to risk upsetting the client employer. If they just needed to keep getting their income today and tomorrow and the next day, because they needed to eat, they didn't want to risk losing their job placement for a risk that may or may not become dangerous in the end, right? Risks don't always play out to become dangerous. So, relying on workers to speak up wasn't terribly effective, we found, from our interviews with both the agencies and the workers about these issues. So, for instance, here's an agency owner who talks about it. He says, we can't be there 24/7, so we have to rely on our workers that are on the job site, and they're instructed. If you see something that's unsafe, then you ask your supervisor to rectify the problem. Or ultimately, if nothing is done about it, you're not obligated to do the job. You know, you can stop working on it. But you should kind of clarify through your supervisor, work with them. We say, so do you have workers coming back to you sometimes? Not very often. I'm hoping they'll bring it up. And here's a worker. We have to carry the heavy boxes. His job placement wasn't supposed to be carrying heavy boxes, and then he found that he was doing that all the time, and it was getting a sore back. He said, eventually our agency said, next time let us know, because you're paid only for the lighter things. But in that situation, you don't want to offend the agency and also the employer both. So it's not a population that is oriented to speaking up. There are too many important, pressing things that take precedence over speaking up. And if you think about our legislation about speaking up, it is based on certain premises about the nature of work and people able to activate their rights and all sorts of things. And there is no more insecure job than working at a temp agency, right? Even if you have a contract, it also often has a term. But if you're working for a temp agency, your job can end in 1 minute, 2 days. You don't know. Even when agencies do hear about a worksite hazard, let's just say the worker speaks up. Sometimes they actually do. There's very little that the agent, what can they do? They can go to the worksite and say, can you guys please tidy that up? And that's the ask nicely approach. Or they can withdraw, say, okay, we're leaving. But agencies valued their contracts, so you don't want to withdraw frivolously, right? And you don't want to offend your contract holder also. So it's something that they have to handle delicately. There we go. So here's the owner of the small agency. He says, on the construction site they're working at, 3 or 4 stories high, there was a big opening and it wasn't railed off or guarded, so someone could easily slip and fall over. So we asked them nicely on 2 or 3 occasions to do something about it. And one of our guys reported that nothing was done. So we said, okay, you're off the job. Until they get it done, we won't send you out there. So that's all they could do was withdraw. And also the consequence for all those workers on the site, that person and their coworkers, they all got pulled off the job. And here's a couple of agency recruiters discussing this issue as well. What happens when you get an employer and things are dangerous and not as they should be? Well, we just make sure that we reduce the people we have working there. Jessica says, we have to make sure we get paid. And Jeremy says, yeah, make sure we get paid and mitigate the risk, the financial risk here, and then shut the doors. So they talked about slowly withdrawing their workers and not resupplying this employer with, but they said, well, if we just withdraw our workers right now, we could be out $20,000, right? They could just decide not to pay. So they were balancing the financial risk to their agency with the physical risk that the workers were facing and trying to manage and mitigate the risk. But in the end, they don't control the work site, right? Oops, I keep pressing the wrong one.
Ellen?
Yeah.
Was there ever a case, or did anyone mention that they might have reported something to the Ministry of Labor, or like that agency in the first quote there could have reported that to, but they probably felt like that would be in a relationship with
there's something that I'm not mentioning here in the talk because there's only so much time, but for instance, agencies can transfer the cost. Say there's a terrible accident and their experience rate premiums are going through the roof, and they feel that the client employer was responsible for that accident, and they can try to transfer the cost over to them. We asked about that a lot. They don't do it for the most part. They really don't, because you don't want to ruin your name in the industry by transferring costs and teeing off client employers. They tell their buddies, you find that you're not getting work anymore. They'd rather absorb it as a business cost and move on. Yeah. The other thing we found is that agency workers have no systematic way to provide input on their own health and safety conditions. Agencies have hundreds of employees, thousands of employees, but in practice, they're not required to have joint health and safety committees. It's a gray zone in Ontario right now. So by law, under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, a joint health and safety committee is required at workplaces at which 20 or more workers are regularly employed. Any agency easily surpasses that by hundreds. Except temp agencies in practice, not required to. The idea is that the temp agency at the client employer site can suffice to manage the hazards that those temp agency workers will face. That's sort of the philosophy right now. We disagree. We found a lot of risks that are specific to being a temp agency worker, and I'll talk about those as we go further with the policy recommendations at the end of this talk. But for now, temp agencies are the only business in Ontario with more than 20 workers that aren't required in practice to have joint health and safety committees. So those were the ways that agencies try to manage injury prevention and the practice of how it plays out. Moving on to the client employer and their role. Well, when accidents happen, their record looks clean, right? It's the agency that is the employer for the purposes of experience rating. They're the ones that get the rebates and the surcharges. It's true that the client employer can be fined under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, but that isn't the day-to-day systematic approach to prevention. That's only in the case of catastrophic incidents after the fact. So we found that client employers have little incentive to improve their safety record for temp agency workers. And here's a quote that sort of describes it from a temp agency. He says, "We are providing industrial labor to a client. The client was receiving a workers' compensation award for best health and safety practices. That day I had 2 people rolled out the back door in the ambulance. The client kept his health and safety record up high because he outsourced to staffing companies all the riskiest jobs, all the heaviest lifting, all the jobs that required any type of dangerous work went to a staffing agency. So his record looked perfect. The WSIB thought he was great. So on paper, he looked pretty good, right? Because the client's experience rating is in a way protected through the hiring of temp agency workers. So it's a bit of a loophole. So then you think, well, geez, if the temp agencies are considered the sole employer and the work is dangerous and they're getting all the dirty work and the heaviest lifting and all that stuff, how do they manage their premiums? Because they're actually getting huge rebates, right? We saw that at the beginning.
The safety group.
The safety group is. So that's not all of them. Yeah. The safety group is. But in what I'm going to be describing now, our members of the safety group are engaged in the practices that I'll be describing now. We can't name names, but it's not as if we found that members of the safety group were drastically different than the people we talked to that weren't. It's a structural issue that we're looking at, rather than good or bad. So how do they manage work accident costs? And we were able to identify 5 ways, and this is probably very limited as well in terms of what we're able to get at. For one thing, employers are classified for their WSIB rates according to the type of work that they do, right? These rate classifications, together with experience rating, can make agency accidents relatively inexpensive. So, when temp agencies pay lower workers' compensation premium rates for work than their client employers would do, they can build their own lower rate into the contract price. And let me explain it to you. So, take an employer who's assessed in a relatively high rate group. So, wooden pallets and boxes, employer rate group. That would be a classic manufacturing one, right? They pay $6.83 for every $100 of payroll. They can outsource this work to the temp agencies, who are assessed as the supply of labor non-clerical rate group at $4.62 per $100 of payroll. With this arrangement, a worker getting hurt in this same warehouse, working with the wooden pallets, their accident would cost a lot less to the agency in terms of the surcharge and premiums than it would to the client employer. So it makes the accident more affordable to the agency. And you can build that into your contract prices. And here, for instance, if you look at the WCF 2010 premium rates, here's the supply of non-clerical labor at $4.62. I had wooden boxes and pallets here as the example at $6.83, but you can see once we started understanding the situation, we started understanding why we were coming across all these workers doing this types of work. In waste and recycling, we found workers there in our group. Inside finishing, industrial, commercial, construction, roofing, masonry, general trucking, all of those rate groups are higher.
So I'm wondering if we work a little differently in that I agree with these premium rates. If you, I guess, have workers in your temp agency dealing with wooden boxes and pallets, up front the temp agency would pay less than the manufacturing company would. But if those workers suffered injuries, it would mean that the temp agency experience was worse than predicted. So wouldn't they, in fact, have a surcharge instead of a rebate?
Yeah, they would. But you can anticipate the surcharge in your contract price. And in the end, the accident costs you less. And this is when we talk to people, this is how they described it as playing out.
Because there's a certain sort of discount factor there. You're not paying 100% experience, I guess.
Yeah.
Can I follow up on that? Because I'm not tracking. But earlier on you said the safety group for the temporary work agencies was getting a big rebate.
So that was our question. So how does it work? Like, how can you? So there's this is one that sort of deals more with costs than the rebate issue, because you would get a surcharge for an accident. But the other thing that is the lost time, the way it's managed, and I don't have a slide on that, but we are looking at like 0 to no lost time claimed in this sector in practice.
So they can have a higher frequency with a lower
lost time.
Lower severity. They just don't have to show it on books.
I talked to I'm thinking about one particular multinational interview who he said, no, we have no lost time. The workers, and I don't have the quote here, he said the workers, you know what, they can manage to get in the next day, and we're talking again about these low wage ones who aren't exactly the most powerful, no, I have my rights types of workers. and they can get them in doing anything. And what he explained to me is that even if they come in, even if they have a doctor's note saying they need to be off work for a week, we find that if we offer them work, they'll take it because they can't afford to wait for the WSIB check to come in. They just can't afford to wait. So the agency knows that. They offer them the work. The agency doesn't care what they're doing. It's cheaper to have them back than to pay the surcharge and have them out. Yeah.
We're at 10 to noon, so we may need to hold substantive questions till we get
We're almost at the end.
Yeah.
So we found some agencies were actually discouraging work injury reports by requiring long, detailed explanations, and also we found the practice of questioning the legitimacy of the injury to be quite widespread among our sample. So here's a multinational agency risk manager who says, office manager who says, they have to come in and fill the 15-page accident report even if they don't see a doctor, because we see a lot of people take advantage of the system. If I get hurt at work, they're still going to pay me. So sometimes I've had people, they come in, they fill in all the paperwork for the claim, and they say, oh my goodness, I wouldn't want to if there wasn't a serious accident, like I would just leave right now type of thing. Now we know that you have to file a Form 7 for any accident, even if it's serious or not serious, right? So it was very interesting the way she explained this, because it appeared to be an explanation of a strategy to discourage anything but the most serious complaints. Or another owner says, we come across it a lot. They have pre-existing back injuries. So there's a lot of contestation of claims based on, well, the worker had pre-existing injuries. Even when a workers' compensation claim is filed, the short duration that workers tend to have on a roster means that the agency employer tends not to have a rehire obligation. When they do have this obligation, the rehiring involves only placing the worker back on the roster. And in that case, like if no employer wants to hire that worker, there's nothing they can do, right? So it's a very loose reemployment obligation, just because of the nature of the workers and by the nature of the rehire obligation. And then agencies also can protect themselves contractually. And here's a risk manager. It's a rather lengthy quote, but it kind of sums things up. He says, lack of experience is always going to be a risk. Lack of knowledge of the site is always going to be a risk. It's almost impossible to manage. Now, this was a risk management specialist for, like, Canada and northeastern United States, where the agency is talking here. We try to take really good job orders. We try to give our workers a good outline of what the job is supposed to be on the site. We do ask our customers to give us site-specific training when they get there, even if it's a quick walk around and show them the hazards. We ask all of our clients to do that, and they sign off that they're going to do it. Now, I don't know if they all do it, but it's certainly asked to be done. And again, when you ask people to do things, you're asking them to do it in writing for more than just, you're hoping, this is the hoping word again, it comes up a lot in our data, you're hoping they will do it, but if they don't do it, you're protecting yourself. Because if someone agreed to do something right, and they don't do it, and something happens, more of the liability goes on them. So there's the fine print of the contracts. That was pretty important. In the end, let's just say that an agency is caught, and they've had fines, very high experience rating. With the smaller ones, they can easily close and reopen. Because I'm not talking about the big agencies that have all their offices that are well known, but the smaller agencies, there's no equipment, right, to run an agency. And so here is a workers' compensation regulator who just was really quite peeved by that situation, saying they're opening and closing all the time, going bankrupt. I mean, you can run a temp agency with a BlackBerry, right? But you're sucking the accident costs with you. Now, the company directors are liable, but if the company has no identifiable assets, there's nothing to collect. So, conclusions and policy recommendations. Various conditions, such as client employers lacking the normal prevention incentives for temp workers, means that these workers are facing relatively high risks. At the same time, these agency workers have less occupational health and safety protection than do regular workers. Their agency employers don't control the work site, don't fully know the risks, and aren't there. And it seems cost effective to have agency workers rather than regular workers get hurt. So these are structural issues, often about loopholes. No one's necessarily doing anything illegally, right? This is just that, in a sense, it's a case of our work environment going faster than our legal environment. So we have a few policy recommendations. The experience rating prevention incentive is currently employed to an employer, to agency, that doesn't control the work or the work site. The client employer also has a minimal prevention incentive. So we recommend applying experience rating to the employer that actually controls the risks at the work site. That was kind of what it was supposed to all be about. Even though temp agency workers, according to all the stats, face high accident risks, there are no joint health and safety committees for their particular risks. And so one of our recommendations is to enforce existing joint health and safety committee requirements. And there are various issues that are specific to temp agency workers. How to navigate job site newness when you're always new to a job. How to manage the social isolation and make connections at jobs to find out from your coworkers about what the risks are. Not knowing where things are. How to manage when a client employer asks you to do extra work or different work. Who to tell and how to tell when there's a risk. And how to tell about a risk without losing your work placement. There are so many issues that a joint health and safety committee for a temp agency could cover. But they don't have one. Temp agency workers won't always speak up, especially the ones at the bottom end of the employment scale. By nature, when you're working for a temp agency, you don't have employment security. And so proactive inspections of workplaces that hire large numbers of temp agencies would seem to be a good strategy for our health and safety inspectors. They already do blitzes here and there. Why not do blitzes focused on companies that regularly and systematically hire large numbers of temp workers? And in the Dean report, this was one of the recommendations, that more proactive inspections of workplaces where vulnerable workers are concentrated would be useful. And workers in the temporary staffing agency were mentioned as well in those report as vulnerable workers. So we have more than 3 recommendations, but for this talk today, I just have these 3 to be mentioned. And then finally, at the end, we went to regulators who were well placed, and we said, how can this work this way, that the prevention incentive is applied to the party that doesn't control the work site and can't manage it? Why? Why do you have this arrangement? And these were the answers that we got. Why doesn't the temp agency sector lobby more strongly for shared responsibility? You think that if they're getting all the premiums, they'd like to share that cost with the client employers, right? It would be in their best interest because they can't control the work site. Well, employers have looked to strip out all non-essential payroll, one of which is WSIB costs, and I think there's probably a financial incentive to go through a temp agency. I'm assuming they're not lobbying because somehow it doesn't make financial sense to do so, even though from a health and safety point of view it might be logical. But that's just the way it goes. And here's another one. And I think the biggest challenge is the idea of responsibility. It could be easily adjusted by saying every workplace is fully responsible, so there's none of this joint or offsetting between one person as the employer and the other is just the location of the work. The regulation needs to switch to the site-specific. But once you get into that, the viability of having a temp agency or using a temp agency disappears, for some employers, I guess. It would be a lot more effective if the workplace was accountability, and that's what has to change. So we're not the only ones saying this. But if you think about it, these temp workers aren't exactly a lobby group unto themselves. They're dispersed, scattered workers with no representation. So if anyone's interested, we've got a couple of publications out already, if you want to read more. I have some references from this talk. And I'd like to acknowledge that this study was funded by the WSIB Research Advisory Council. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellen. We are at noon, but maybe we'll take one or two questions for those who can stay, and others might come up, Ellen, after. And I see Mary's
Are
got
there any good examples of good temporary agencies?
Yeah.
Right now, it just sounds like they're all horrible.
Well, it's not. That's why I want to emphasize that it's not. It's not as if they're like bad people, for instance. So we met temp agency employers who care. Said I care about my workers and I want to talk to them. So we did see that. But structurally, the way the laws are applied, it doesn't offer temp agency workers the same protection as regular workers. And that's what we want to highlight, that there is a major gap here. So, yeah.
I think one of the other things too is going from a temp worker to a permanent one. There's huge fees paid to the temp agencies. So there are a lot of organizations that will continue going the temp way and not pay those huge fees.
Well, thanks to Benita, that's limited.
That is limited now as a result of Bill 139.
Yeah.
Came into effect in November of 2009. They can only charge those fees for the first 6 months of the workers working through their agency for the client.
We think maybe one more, and otherwise maybe we'll just huddle up here after.
Policy question. Is there a regulatory distinction between a temporary work agency or a temporary work and contract work?
In the WCIB operational policy manual, they have distinct language for temporary agency workers in terms of placing them back on the roster. So there's a regulatory distinction there in terms of return to work and WSIB.
But there's no statement that says something in either the policy or in case law that if you employ the same workers or the same group of workers, class of workers, over a period of time, then that gets reclassified as contract.
So there is case law. Yeah, there has been recent case law. It was a company that was regularly hiring the same drivers over and over again, and then they were deemed to be the employers and required to set up a joint health and safety committee. In this case, we have the complication of the 3 different employers. And so, actually, I brought it with me because I was hoping someone would ask. Thank you, Dan. There's the complication of who is going to be the employer for this particular situation. So for the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act, it's just the temp agency, and we're saying that is not a natural situation. It doesn't have to be like that. There was a 1997 judgment of the Supreme Court of Canada involving a temp agency in Quebec, and they noted that the legislation must be adjusted in non-traditional employment relationships to meet the specific objectives of the legislation. And that's what we find is not happening here. Similarly, the Ontario Labour Relations Board acknowledged the client employer as the employer for purposes of the Labour Relations Act, despite the conclusion that the temp agency was the employer for the purposes of the Employment Standards Act. So the key difference between the agencies and other types of temp contracts is that you have these multiple employers. It's a bit different.
Okay, I think we'll stop the formal questions now. Thank you again, Helen. Clear and interesting.